Cool. Well, hello everyone. I'm presuming there's some people in the room I can't actually see, but I'm just going to guess that they are. Welcome to Ask the Analysts for the Stadium Naming Rights report that we've just brought out. For those who haven't been to one of these webinars before, the purpose of this basically is to give some context about the report, why we've done it, some of the key storylines in the report, and answer any questions that, well, we can answer and that we are able to answer that you might have about it. Just give you a bit more context. So let's kick this things off. So today, the analysts we have Rachel, who is the author of the report. We have Aidan, who is research manager and controls all things data. And we have Ben, who is the global sponsorship editor. And they'll be talking through some of the storylines and, like I said, some of the key data points that we unearthed during putting this report together. So on the agenda today, as I mentioned, we're going to just quickly cover why we decided to do this report now. We're going to talk about some of the key storylines that emerged. There'll be some time at the end for a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please do shoot them through. I think there's a way of doing that in the webinar. So I'll be seeing them throughout the webinar and we can save those to the end. And then next steps, if you want to purchase the report. Great. So obviously when we decide which reports to do, there always needs to be a good reason behind that. And for stadium naming rights, there are several really good reasons why we thought now's the time to do this. So we last did this report in 2021, and since then there's been quite a significant change in the market. There's been obviously an increase in new stadium builds globally. That's really impacting the market. I mean, obviously that includes the US, UK and Europe and Saudi. And often in these cases, stadium naming rights are one of the ways that, a venue or an operator can actually build a stadium to fund it. So it's put the topic sharply into focus. Additionally, the North American market has long been a dominant market, but we are obviously seeing that outside the US, things are picking up. So similarly to where the new markets are going, the UK, Europe, and Middle East are really burgeoning markets for this activity. Also, from a brand point of view, stadium naming rights is a really attractive proposition now. Obviously, they're a very different type of marketing than digital marketing and trying to cut through the clutter there. They do offer that long-term physical and digital brand presence, and they also offer brands the opportunity to host clients, customers, and create synergy with an audience base that they otherwise might not be able to do that with. And then finally, there's been some really big deals in recent years, and those deals have reset benchmarks. Now, obviously, there's some really major deals that are approaching renegotiation and renewal time at the moment. So it seemed like the right time to take stock of the market and do a deep dive into the subject. So just to give you guys obviously a recap of the report, we split this into two. Part one of the report is a real deep dive into the business models, the trends, the legal issues, and the activations that are really prevailing globally at the moment. And then part two is when you can see all that juicy data. That's when we do a deep market analysis on the US and North American market, the European and UK, and the rest of the world. So that's the report. Obviously, at the end, I'll kind of recap again and tell you next steps if you're interested in buying it or finding out more. But for now, we're going to run through some of the key storylines, and I'm going to hand over to Rachel. So obviously, this isn't going to cover everything that's in the report, but it's just some of the key highlights that we found that we want to kind of give to you and tell you about. So yeah, I'll hand over to Rachel now.
Thanks, Duncan. And I'll also be sharing the floor with my colleague Aidan, who has much more to say about the data than I possibly could. My role was more interviewing key players in the market, sort of creating the narrative and the stories around some of the deals that have been taking place over the last few years and that might be happening in the future. US was very interesting. I mean, naming rights essentially starts in that market. So we felt it was appropriate to start the report with a bit of history behind that context. And it's quite interesting because naming rights in the US started quite a lot driven by families or local business people putting their names to these venues. And this is now mirroring in college sports where that has happened there. But now they're looking beyond that to potential external partners as a new revenue source. So North America still will continue to dominate, but there's definitely growth within that sector. And there are some other sectors of growth too, which you'll find out in the report. Aidan, if you have anything to say on this slide, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is a data point from our market overview, which sits in chapter 8 of the report, which is in the second section. I think Duncan touched upon it there, but if you haven't read the executive summary, our data scope for this report is naming rights deals across the top 5 US leagues and also the top 4 European football leagues. The written content in the first section report is a bit more expansive than that, but for that second section, that's our scope for the data. I guess the obvious point to make here with this data point is that we can see that the US market is almost $2 million US more per year than the European market, and this is across all the deals in our scope. There is a greater volume of deals in the US market, so naturally new deals and renewals are occurring more often, which does push that average. What I find even more interesting is when you crunch the numbers a little bit more. If you take the top 10 value deals across each market from the US and then from Europe, the US sponsor deals are actually worth double that of the European deals. So you can see the US market backed up by the stat about top 10 deals and this higher average here. They're very top heavy across their stadium name rights deals. This is also reflected by the fact that we know 51% of the total value across the US leagues is actually contributed by the top 30 deals in the US. I think what we've done well in this report is we've dovetailed the written content nicely with the data. For example, I know that specifically chapters 1 and 5, we've explained how the US is a much more mature market with a better pricing structure. I think, Rachel, you've come across that. I think that was in chapter 1 and chapter 5, as I said. I think on that point of pricing, and the data backs this up, is that the US has many more multi-team and multi-sport venues leading to higher value deals in that market. To back up that point even further, we know that there are 16 naming rights deals for just shared stadiums alone. If we was to put that in as the ranking amongst all the leagues, that would actually sit in second behind NFL at around 170 million annually. I know I've spoken here a lot about the US market. I think if we can move on to the next slide, we can look at the growth, the steady growth in the European market. Yeah, so as we can see,
Aidan, sorry, shall I just give a bit of context to
yeah,
the
absolutely, yeah.
market, just in terms of as Aidan's saying, there's maturity in the US market, but for those of you who are thinking, yeah, well, what about outside the US and North America? There's definitely opportunity in Europe, and as Duncan said earlier, in other markets around the world, such as Middle East and even in Asia. Essentially, the growth's been driven in the football side of the market, but we are seeing some growth too in other sports, which is quite interesting. You may have heard of the Allianz deal to take over Twickenham's name. And essentially, there are some other opportunities we've been seeing in cricket and golf as well. So in terms of the data, Aidan, back to you.
Yeah, so as you said, I think the kind of growth was around 40 million from the last time we did the report in 2021 till now. That's on an annual basis, and that's US dollars. And I think that, like you mentioned there about there's been long-term partners especially with football clubs such as Emirates, Amex, who've renewed their long-standing partnerships for high value and longer duration, which has upped that annual value each year. Also, I think what we need to factor in is there's been that kind of US model adopted in Europe, where new builds and renovations have seen a new wave of stadium name rights deals, which again has added that value each year. I also think that that new wave of deals has kind of navigated what is a tricky market in Europe, in the sense that I feel like a lot of stadiums in Europe have that kind of emotional, sentimental value. I think, again, Rachel, you touched upon a point in, I think it was chapter 4 maybe, where there was the fan power and there was a bit of resistance against, these naming rights deals coming in against historic stadiums. So I think when you look at this kind of the steady growth in Europe, it's quite commendable when they're in a tricky kind of situation. I think here this top capacity kind of stadiums graphic here, it, I always feel like the social barometer as such for stadiums is capacity. I think in terms of stadium name rights, there's 4 here in this list that are sponsored. So that kind of gives you that European landscape where it's a mix of new stadiums with sponsors and also old stadiums with sponsors. I'm not sure if you had anything to add to that, Rachel, or even Ben.
I mean,
I
Ben, you
think,
probably, yeah, sorry, I was going to say you probably have a view on that.
yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, it's as Aidan alluded to, it's an opportunity. If you're doing a new build, it's a clean slate. You can draw a line under a historic name, and overcome some of those fan reservations about carrying a brand on the name of a building. You've seen it with Everton. They're moving out of Goodison. They're going to move into a new venue. It's a perfect time to get a naming deal in place, and you can almost offset those fan reservations by saying, well, look, this is underwriting the cost to a certain extent of this venue. Excuse me, venue. Tottenham were also trying to do it with their stadium. It's taken them a bit longer. You look at the US. We did a survey last year for our global sponsorship report, and that there was a confidence barometer within that, and a lot of the US agencies were saying the reason that they're so confident about the US market is because of this new wave of new builds that's coming through.
I think another interesting point in terms of America and naming rights, we're also seeing a greater growth in the sort of entertainment experience that people get at venues in Europe. So that's something else that came across in the report. So while there might not be opportunities in the US for some of you guys in terms of getting your naming rights out there are, alongside the growth in Europe and the rest of the world, we are seeing that there are opportunities to engage in that deeper, sort of more entertainment-driven way with fans. The financial institutions, that they are the leading category in terms of sponsorships for venues in America. And I think what's great, and crypto.com, obviously they're a financial institution, they're a crypto platform. What they've done in taking over the Staples Center, they had quite a tough job. That was a stadium that had had that name for years and years. So they've had to come in as a sector that's still quite new to some people, and they try and turn around that association with the incumbent historic partner. So what they've done, and what we're seeing with other financial brands around the world with some of the naming rights deals, is that they're really creating these sort of living case studies for their products. And so having installations and opportunities for people when they come to their arenas to really find out what they're actually doing. And crypto in particular had a lot of education to do and community building when they took over that.
Just, I was going to add there, Rachel, there was a similar case study with Allianz and Twickenham. A lot of antipathy from fans when they were going to take on the Twickenham naming rights, and they offset that to a large extent with community initiatives. They talked about a future fund for local club rugby clubs, that are struggling. Participation numbers are down in rugby. So it's a great opportunity for them to get the Twickenham naming asset and then offset that with those community initiatives supporting the game. And you look at the RFU, and it's I think it made a loss of about 30 million in its last set of accounts. So a great time for Allianz to come in and be seen to be supporting rugby, supporting the RFU, and assuaging some of those fan reservations about the name change to Twickenham. I think Aidan's going to talk about dominant sectors here now, aren't you, Aidan?
Yeah, so this is again a graphic from our North American analysis. So you can see that banking pays almost 4 times as more as their nearest competitor, which is general insurance. I think that's actually a reflection, and yeah, you might be able to weigh in on this, Rachel or Ben, where I think that's a reflection of the global sponsorship landscape, to be honest with you, where, we're finding that banking sponsors and sponsors from the financial sector probably have those bigger budgets and larger marketing spends, so they can, facilitate the top deals, especially when it comes to naming rights. I think when you look further into who the brands are, which you can obviously do within this report, you can see that they're global brands. They have global operations, and they're also multifaceted in the products and the services that they offer, which kind of leads into that, the aspect of you have multiple different people going into a stadium. So therefore, what product can we have to fit their need, and create that consumer base? I think, Ben, the next slide is actually about Allianz, so you might be able to expand on your point from earlier.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't think it's an accident that banking and insurance are heavily embedded in stadium naming rights. I think stadium communicates a sense of permanence, reliability. If you're a bank or an insurance group, you want to, tell people that you're there for the long term. I don't know. I mean, even in the case of airlines, I wonder whether or not it sort of communicates a sort of sense of safety and permanence as well. I think, yeah, Allianz, I mean, as you say, they're probably the most active brand in this space. It started off with the Allianz Arena, which dates back to the wave of new builds that went up for the 2006 World Cup, FIFA World Cup in Germany. As you say, they've just done the Twickenham deal. They've obviously got a taste for stadium deals, and there is a section in the report, isn't there, Rachel, about exactly how they identify these opportunities and what they're trying to communicate. There's some sort of key metrics that they use on there.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, it made sense to cover Allianz. They're a pioneer in this space. It's interesting because they started like many other naming rights sponsors, and that they wanted to stay local. So, it was no coincidence that they were based in Munich, and that's why that was their first stadium. But as they're also a global company, they realized their reach needed to go beyond their local market. So, like some other leading brands, they're now expanding beyond that, and they're present in all 4 continents. I think, all continents around the world. So, what's interesting about their motivation for the sponsorship is that they see insurance being related to the ups and downs of life, and they see that aligning very much to a sports or music experience at one of their venues. So it's sort of aligning with that ups and downs of life, and then measuring success through how they build those collaborations with communities and engage with them. So they tend to have longer deals in Europe because they see the value of imprinting on a particular stadium. We do see deals tend to be a bit shorter in Europe compared to the US, but Allianz are very adamant that they have to be associated with a venue to really get that maximum imprinting. So as we just said, globalization, but also that local feel.
That actually ties in with one of the questions I've just seen come up, which maybe is a good time to tackle that now. So one of the questions from someone, anonymous attendee, are we likely to see more short-term or flexible naming rights deals as opposed to what has been traditionally long-term contracts? I don't know if anyone has a view on that. Like from the report, from our findings, do we see, our short-term flexible deals going to be more prevalent, or?
One of the experts I spoke to for the report, he felt that in Europe in particular, there's a disconnect between how long people are in those major marketing jobs that can then be around to see the longer deals through. Whereas in the US, people tend to be in those roles longer. So they seem to think that potentially they would stay shorter than in the US. Ben, Aidan, I don't know if you have anything that you picked up on in your research.
I think most rights holders would be reluctant to strike a short-term deal, because once you do the stadium deal, that brand becomes synonymous with that venue. And say you were to do a 5-year deal, that puts the rights holder in a tight spot. If the brand drops out, they're going to find it tricky to identify a new brand that's going to come in and take the name of a venue that, I mean, it does happen. Crypto.com took the Staples Center, but a lot of brands are very wary of that. you don't want to be associated with something that's already got a sort of a brand associated with it. So, I mean, I know for a fact that Everton are targeting a minimum of 10 years for their stadium deal. And just the very nature of these deals, they're community driven deals, brands that are trying to embed themselves in the very fabric of a club and really cement a position with fans. So I don't think so. I don't think it's a trend that's going to sort of take off across the board.
I think another case study in the report touches on that too quite well too, with the I'm a Phoenix Suns fan, full disclosure on the NBA, and I have watched the name change of their arena over the last few years and wondered how that affects their brand as a team. Recently, Footprint pulling out of their sponsorship, and they're forced to find another naming rights sponsor, 2 within 5 years, and they'd had previous name changes before. So there is that I'd go back to the alliance and the imprinting that you get through the longer deals. However, we are in a climate of economic uncertainty, as I'm sure we're all aware. So that could be having an influence on maybe people actually doing deals in the first place. So maybe it's not the length of the contract that might be an issue. It might be, are people going to commit the way things are at the moment? So read the report to find out.
Cool. And then, yeah, I think Aidan, just to talk through maybe just what we've looked at when it comes to Allianz. I think it's just a snippet of the data we have in the report.
Yeah, so yeah, I think we touched upon it already. This is their kind of Allianz family of stadiums. You can see it's predominantly European, I would say, and then it has the stadium in Sydney, and then one in America as well, and then obviously one in South America. So there is a global representation here. The most recent one being the RFU deal, as Ben touched upon. So yeah, in the report there is some values here for this, and we have the durations as well. So yeah, I would say head to the report and find out more about Allianz. The case study that Rachel put together is brilliant.
Just some other stories and interesting case studies we have in the report. We've already talked about crypto.com. West Ham's an interesting one. One of the stories that came out of the report was that the value of having stakeholders that align and work together well. And one might argue in the case of West Ham, that hasn't been the case. Ben's studied this story at greater length and probably has some more insight, but it was an incumbent Olympics legacy. So there's also the issue of whether they'll ever be able to take the Olympics moniker away from it. So, and then Ben's also mentioned that the pricing around the Spurs stadium. So Ben, I don't know if you have any more up-to-date info on either of those.
So the London stadium, we know, I mean, we reported they were very close with Allianz. I think it was at the turn of last year. Yeah, December 23, I think it was. And they pulled out all the stops. They brought London Mayor Sadiq Khan, Sebastian Coe into this charm offensive to get a breakthrough with Allianz. And that deal was going to be priced at about 7 million per annum over 10 years. So it looked like their sort of long search for a sponsor was finally going to end. And they were quite clever about the way they did it. They actually brought the rest of the Olympic Park to bear in it. So they were actually proposing that it wasn't just the stadium, but it was also about this, I don't know if people have been to the London Olympic Park, but it's a real sort of community venue, massive site, lots of different things there, arts, entertainment, music events. So it wasn't just the venue, but as Rachel says, it's quite a messy situation because the London Legacy Development Corporation is selling the asset, but obviously it's got a major tenant in the shape of West Ham. The LRDC would get 4 million, the first 4 million of any deal, and then share the rest 50-50 with West Ham. So if you're looking at that, potential deal with Allianz, West Ham would have got about 1.5 million per annum from that. So it's not the greatest incentive for West Ham to, get excited about. It's yeah, I mean, who knows what's going to happen next. We know they've actually offered it to West Ham. I think they've offered West Ham to buy out the rights for about 5 million per annum, but as far as we know, they've never taken them up on that offer. I mean, the longer it goes on, it's like Tottenham. The harder it becomes. Brands would be looking at it and saying, well, why has nobody else gone for this so far? And there's probably also a question about whether what the London stadiums become synonymous with. Yes, there's that sort of halo effect from the Olympics, but there's also people look at the venue and they think that they're well aware of the cost to taxpayers. They know that it's got this legacy commitment to host athletics, but because the stadium wasn't designed for football, when they sort of switched to athletics, they've got to put a load of seats in where or take a load of seats out where the athletics track used to be. So it's very complicated, very expensive. And I think it's costing the taxpayer about 10 million per annum. I can't remember the exact figure, but yeah, it's very costly. So it's not a clean sale, if you like, for sponsors, and that might be the reason why it hasn't sold so far.
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic because West Ham, they're not allowed, well, they have no right to enter that venue when it switches to athletics. So there's sort of disconnect between who actually is the incumbent there and who isn't. But ownership has now switched from the legacy entity to the local authorities. So it'll be interesting to see if relationships improve and maybe something will happen. But yeah, it's an interesting case study.
Cool. So that kind of rounds up the storylines from the report. Now it's time for the Q&As, and I had a few questions come in. Obviously, feel free now, if anything's come to mind during this presentation, if you want to ask, we'll be more than happy to, well, try and answer any questions you might have. So I'm going to run through a few of these now. So got a question from Paul on, is there a relationship between the price paid for a stadium naming rights and the price paid for an adjacent convention center or other meeting venue? Yeah, does anyone feel able to take that one on?
It can be hard to find that out because sometimes the deals relating to the actual build of the venue in the first place include those ancillary areas. So they can actually be included in the whole sort of build funding model. So we go into the pricing structure in the report, but in terms of the actual ancillary and localized sort of venues, that's something we could probably do some extra research for. If you needed it, get in touch.
Cool. And another question from another Paul. How much value in kind is built into the significant stadium naming deals, and in what ways? So is that ticketing, hospitality, activation?
I mean, the famous one was the Enron with the Houston Rocket. They essentially they supplied the power as part of that deal. Sorry, the Houston Astros. That was partly value in kind, partly funding that stadium. That all went awry anyway when there was a financial sort of scandal at the time. But certainly those sorts of things are built into some of the deals for sure. So telecoms is another example.
Yeah, you often see it with tech deals, don't you, Rachel, where you get a technology brand that will come in and provide connectivity services for the venue, 5G services. So they're embedded in actually, the stadium build. And therefore, yeah, that's probably, the VIK element. There'll be a cash component and a VIK component to the deal.
In terms of activation too, I know for a fact that, again, because it's a case study in the report, United Airlines and their sponsorship in Chicago with the Bulls and the Blackhawks, that does include an element of travel for the team, and also they activate with the fans by offering them airline-based, travel and tickets and those sorts of things. So again, that's part of the deals we're seeing.
And we should emphasize that some of the fees in this report, it's very nuanced. I mean, you provide one fee, but it's the stadium, the fee for the actual stadium rights, it's just the tip of the spear, as a US agency exec might say. It's, there's a suite of assets. There'll be hospitality lounges, tickets, activation areas and things like that. So, it's the overall value that we're reporting on in this report.
Yeah, on that topic, actually, another question is about the main driver of price. So that's what we obviously did a whole chapter about pricing the deal. Question here is, what is the main driver of price? Is it attendance and capacity? Is it the age of the venue, the fans of the team, or something else entirely?
I've got a great quote about that from one of our interviewees. He said the perfect storm when it comes to pricing is I shouldn't probably reveal this, you need to buy the report really, but this is a sneak peek. A perfect storm of the macroeconomic environment, the situation with the tenant club, where in the life cycle is a stadium, i.e. is it a new build because the price will be better for you, and how is the team performing? So those tend to be the sort of the factors. Ben, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to that. I mean, obviously there are other things like media exposure as well and other elements.
Yeah, age of the building, size of the addressable market, how many sports events are passing through. If it's got loads of music events, then that's obviously a big driver. There's a quote from AEG in it as well. They've got a pricing tool, haven't they? And they talk about they put everything into this, even if there's a motorway sign next to the stadium. That thousands of people are going to see every day saying, I don't know, Allianz Arena. They price that in the, when they're trying to price the asset, they'll include, loads of sort of intangibles like that. So, any number of factors could go into the price of a venue. And, the trick is just working out what really makes the brand tick.
I mean, ultimately,
I would also add.
Say again, sorry.
Sorry, I was going to just add that I think it goes back to my point about how the multi-shared, the multi-team stadiums have such a high annual worth that it's all of those factors, and that on top where you have those two stadium teams, whether it's an NHL team, NBA team, NFL team, MLS team, I think that just creates that extra exposure because you have in those two teams play at that one venue.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the lawyers we spoke to said it's all about the eyeballs, not that very basic level. Eyeballs.
Actually, linked to that question, another one is about the difference between the US and Europe, and specifically promotion and relegation. Yeah, so the question basically is, to what extent do you think that has an effect on that difference in value? The fact that obviously in North American leagues, relegation often isn't a concern for a team. They know they're going to be in the Premier League.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the influences of why the US market can have such higher prices, because they do have that security. They don't have to worry. Conversely, when it comes to relegation, however, that does present opportunities, we've noticed, particularly in the UK market, because some of the lower level teams are more receptive to having a naming rights deal. They don't, maybe the fans are more receptive to and understanding that they need income to come from somewhere. So relocation itself isn't necessarily a constraint. It just might be in terms of opportunity, but it might be in terms of pricing.
And it also, I mean, they can protect themselves in contractually by having a clause that says that the fee goes down if you get relegated, and that is the case for the if West Ham agrees a deal, there's a price for if they're playing in the EFL Championship, but there's also escalators if they qualify for Europe or they win a trophy. So yeah, brands can protect themselves in that situation.
Yeah, that touches on, I guess, the legal side of things, which I think Rudolph was asking about. He just wanted a bit of context on basically how the legal side of things affect or impact naming rights, and maybe what we cover in the report, just a broad overview.
Again, without giving away the entire report, I mean, a key message that came through from a lot of the lawyers I speak to is that in the past it did tend to be about the money, whereas now, I think particularly since the Enron scandal I mentioned earlier, over the last couple of decades, there's been a tightening up of contracts, and I think the pandemic as well really heightened that sort of force majeure aspect where you need to cover what might happen. So it's about financial robustness. You don't want to associate yourself potentially with someone who might end up in a scandal. So we're seeing a tightening up of clauses in those areas and enforceability of those. Also, exit clauses apparently are becoming more common. You do need to give someone an out if they need to for their reason, potentially leave that deal. Contracts becoming more stable. There's just more rigor behind them, and I think we'll just definitely see more of that, particularly with climate change as well. There are some clauses written into some of the naming rights deals that if something happened, that again a force majeure, a weather event that meant they couldn't compete, there might be some some kickback to the sponsor. Equally, you know, companies are getting taken over. So the naming rights sponsor, what happens if they get taken over by another company? That needs to be in the contract. What happens if the team suddenly has a new owner? What happens if the venue suddenly has a second or third team joining that wasn't there before? And then that opens the whole debate around ambush. So contracts, basically someone said to me that a naming rights contract is litigation on steroids. And I think that sums it up perfectly.
Cool. And we're going to have to start charging more for this if we start giving out more legal advice.
Amazing, I can remember, to be honest.
Yeah. So just a couple of questions to get through. So one question here is, how does the naming rights fee of a new build compare to an existing stadium?
You broke up there, Duncan, sorry.
Sorry, how does the naming rights fee of a new build compare to an existing stadium?
I might let Ben answer that because I feel I've been talking too much.
It's quite hard to talk about that, you know, across the board, but I'd say, well, generally speaking, the newer the building, the higher the fee.
I have a data point around that, Ben. So
Go on, Aidan,
in
tell
terms of
me.
the top 10 value deals in the European market, at least 5 of them have had either renovations or been built within the last 10 to 15 years. So that kind of sets again, to your point, it's hard to actually kind of pinpoint that difference, but that gives you a kind of suggestion of how that question sits as an answer.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to associate with an old crumbly building because old crumbly buildings don't tend to attract major events because the fan experience isn't that great, and you know the tech and everything else that goes with hosting lots of people isn't up to the required standard. So I don't know, if you're thinking about where to host the Super Bowl, you take it to the SoFi Stadium or the Levi's Stadium, rather than, you know, something that's crumbling that doesn't have a roof and is freezing in winter.
I guess the difference is if the crumbling one is an iconic venue, though, like Twickenham. Allianz were very pleased to be able to fund some of the renovations that are going to happen there. So I suppose there are still opportunities in those older ones too.
Cool. And then, yeah, the final question is, are brands willing to pay more for naming rights when they are based in the same city as that event venue? So when they have obviously already that connection to the city or the place.
That definitely seems to be a model we've seen in the report through the interviews we've done. And it's not just, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, historically, a naming rights sponsorship tended to be linked to the local market that somewhat, you know, a company was headquartered in. What we're seeing now, I mean, Brighton is a good example with American Express in the UK, and that's the American Express is local headquarters, as in sort of regional headquarters, is in Brighton. So it made sense for them to have that deal with the stadium. So definitely local is probably still king, if that's the right term. But there's still opportunities. I mean, Emirates, Etihad sponsoring in the British market, that's obviously not their home markets, but they see that as markets where they could get customers. So there's definitely more expansion past the local side of things.
Cool. Well, great. Well, thank you for sending in those questions. Really interesting stuff. So that kind of wraps up the presentation today. In terms of what's next, if you're interested in the report, obviously it's available on the website. We're also happy to answer any questions you might have specifically in case you're not quite sure if it's for you, or any questions you might have. And then a shameless plug right at the end in terms of what we have coming up for the rest of the year. We have the Premier League and Serie A sponsorship reports coming out very soon. There's a global cricket report, private equity report, US college sports, and a global motorsport report, all to come. Again, any interest in those, you want to find out more, just drop us an email and we'd be happy to answer any questions. So yeah, thank you for everyone for your time. Hope that was informative, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.